Welcome back to the Defense Port Podcast. I'm Stewart Webb, and with me is Chris Murray. We are talking just after it has become known that Péter Magyar, Hungary's opposition leader, is now leader in waiting for the new Hungarian government.
Yeah, it looks like he handily won the election, which I don't think anyone was really surprised about, but I was pleasantly surprised to learn that Orbán had is the word ceded?
Conceded.
Conceded, thank you. Conceded that he'd accepted defeat, which wasn't a foregone conclusion that he would. There was rumbling earlier today that they were already suggesting, oh, there's been a high level of irregularities in the election, which was a warning, red flag, right?
Oh, totally right. I mean, the government had already said much earlier that they were going to accept the voting results from the people, but when I think it was like last week, they said that there was going to be more scrutiny as to the results, and they may not concede defeat right away. So that was definitely,
Yeah, I
that
was concerned when I saw tweets and stuff about them reporting irregularities, but then you were pointing out to me that voter turnout was almost 80%, like 78% or 80% last you checked or something like that, 78.
was 78. Yeah, it
That's
is.
that's awfully high. And for folks listening at home, that's usually a clear sign when you have somebody who's been in power, or Orban's been in power 20 years, 16 uh, in a row, and then I think there's another. I read somewhere else there was a four and then a gap and then six. Anyways, he's been in power for nearly 2 decades, and when you have that kind of voter turnout, it's usually not because they're excited about you.
So that's actually what led to us wanting to talk about what Chris and I have for quite some time been calling boomer dictators in our own private conversations. The leadership that has been in power for quite some time. So Erdogan, Putin, Orbán, Xi, who are 65 and over, right? I mean, Xi's 72, Putin I think is 73. Trump right now is 76, and Erdogan's in the 70s as well. So, without any clear successors, there's going to be strategic and political ramifications when they, as Chris would say, father time catches up with them.
Yeah, that's sort of, you know, I was watching the Hungarian election today a little bit, and that's more what I was thinking about was the there's going to be a lot of people that jump on this, and the first thing they're going to say is, oh, especially progressives on the left, are going to be like, oh, look at this, look how great this is. This is another strong rejection of the right wing, which is something we also heard in the UK when Keir Starmer won, which is a brutal misreading of what was going on. Like that betrays a complete lack of understanding. And I think with Hungary, I don't know Hungarian politics as well, so I wouldn't be as confident to say that. But what I think we're seeing is more a rejection of establishment politics, not right-wing rejection. I think what you're seeing is just a rejection of establishment, be it the way the conservatives were polling before Trump scared the crap out of Canadians, uh, the the rejection of the Conservative Party in the UK, what you're seeing in Serbia. They've had protests since November 2024, basically nonstop. Hungary, but these are, I don't think that these are an exclusive. I mean, the election of Trump, I think, is a rejection of establishment, very clearly a rejection of establishment politics. So I don't think that this is an issue of left and right. And I think it would be a mistake to look at it that way. I think the more valuable lens to approach this through or to view this through would be the rejection of establishment, which is what connects this. How I connect this is what Stewart was just talking about with the boomer leaders is something I call the boomer void. We're sort of dealing with the swan song of this entire generation, be it a dictator who's in the 70s or just a generational, like in the case of US presidents since Clinton being of the same generation. Although I don't know if that's true of Obama, but generally speaking, they've all been immediate post-war. You know, we have this host of aging autocratic leaders and we have an aging leadership class in the West. As Stewart said, Father Time's going to catch up with them and remove them, many of them in the coming years. And many run powerful states that are in decline and face smaller, but importantly, younger dissident groups. And so the question is, what's the geopolitical strategic consequences of power vacuums which occur when these folks all start kicking off? So that's what I was looking at, Stuart, when I was looking at the Hungary election, and that's what I was hoping we could talk a little bit about.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting with Péter Magyar because he does want to shift closer to Brussels rather than Moscow. He wants to. He's indicated this by saying he will increase NATO defense spending to 5% by 2035, which would meet the Hague commitment. He will, as part of this, though, target industrial corruption within Hungary. And that's going to be the big stepping block for Magyar going forward, is that the Hungarian government, the way it's been for the past 16 years under Orban, has been entirely corrupt.
Yeah, it's a
And
personality cut. It's all a cult of personality, and it's all cronyism. The entire state is built around Orban and Orban's cronies, and it's great. Like you're bringing this up because there's going to be a lot of discussion about the immediate positive effects, and there may be some, like Hungary removing its veto, but it's going to be. I think what you're alluding to is it's going to be a very long road for him.
totally. I mean, think about it. Defense officials aren't going to get their cut back from, ammunition contracts. Even
Hmm.
the local, police officer probably won't be getting his kickback from whatever illicit operations he has on the go as well. I mean, it's all levels, and so Magyar
Sure.
is going to clean house, and in
Yeah,
order
and
to
it's very easy to look at the top level, but what you just alluded to with like the local policeman, that's going to take yeah, that's a really important point. Is it's all levels, and those lower levels, that's going to be a lot harder, and that's
yeah,
going to take a lot longer, and that's going to limit what he can do.
exactly, and that's what his legacy is going to be, right? If he's going to be successful, he has to attack that, or essentially Orban and his government could come back in the next election, right?
Well, and there's also the concern of how he goes about doing it, right? Because he could end up being just as bad in cracking down on this cronyism. He could end up using the people he knows and trusts that are closest to him and use some rather unsavory, sort of like oppressive methods. Like one of the things I'd spoken to you about off, I guess not off camera, but off microphone, I suppose would be the way to put it, is the opposition leader, Peter Magyar, has already come out and accused JD Vance of election interference, which is maybe a signal of what's to come, maybe a pivot towards Europe, but also a pivot towards like finding justification for cracking down. I don't know. It could mean a number of things. It's too early to tell, but I thought it was very interesting that he's already said that.
Yeah, and so if our listeners aren't aware of this, J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, flew to Hungary and became part of one of Orban's.
Essentially, he was stumping for Orban.
Obviously, we're going to see what was going to happen with that. But as Chris and I were talking about, is that it's not. It could be seen as a form of electoral interference, but it's one of those electoral interferences that have occurred all over. So in Canada, for example, as Chris was alluding to earlier. Actually, Chris, why don't you go ahead and
Yeah, so what I was talking to Stewart about as the this accusation against JD Vance, Stewart had said, "Well, that's not entirely unjustified," and yeah, I agree. I don't have an issue with Stewart saying that. I think it sort of reflects in lack of understanding for the times we live in, which is something I want to come back to is the changing times. So remind me of that, Stewart. But the idea that these things are national and isolated and insulated is, I think, outdated. Like it or not, I don't see this as unique with JD Vance, right? In recently, the Trump administration met with Alberta separatists, which are a small minority in Canada. I don't take them very seriously. I don't think anyone should, but people in Canada were complaining about, oh, this is a sign that the US is already at war with Canada and like they're trying to break us up. And I had to point out, well, three Canadian premiers or former premiers, which are leaders of our provinces, or governors for some folks in different countries, they'd organize Canadians to go and canvass in the US, going door to door for Kamala Harris. So this isn't a unique thing. We've seen UK and Canadian or UK and American quite often politicians. We've seen perhaps a little bit more of it on the right, but I don't know if that's actually fair. Because left-wing politicians progressives have largely been in power in the West, and so it doesn't seem the same when two sitting leaders are together. But the point I'm getting at is like in the modern era with social media and the internet, these aren't really national movements anymore. They're supra or international. So it's more these political silos or movements that are similar or shared values across Western countries, whether it be a right-wing rejection of post-nationalist wokeism, I suppose, for a term, or like anti-migration, or if it's on the left and it's an embrace of equity, diversity, and inclusion. You're seeing these folks reaching across borders for aid with one another. You saw Trudeau, for example, and Jacinda Ardern. It's an interesting phenomenon. but I think it's more reflective of just sort of the changing state of politics. But that was something I observed from it that I wanted to bring up. I was talking about J.D. Vance early on when he had that speech before the Europeans about the erosion of free speech in Europe and in the UK. And I have to say he has a valid point. You may not like who it's coming from. It may be the pot calling the kettle black, but this is part of circling back around to our broader theme here of the boomer void. Uh, there's an increasing effort to try and control events as they become more uncontrollable, as things become more tense. You know, Stuart, you and I have talked about this. It's something we're seeing across the globe where these younger people, they're being locked out and disenfranchised, and they don't really have a viable course. And if one isn't provided for them, a viable course for like that generational power transfer that's inevitably coming, they'll come up with their own.
So in Russia, we're seeing that they're creating a digital iron curtain, blocking social messaging apps such as Telegram and WhatsApp, trying to force the populace towards a government-approved and run messaging app. Also, the attacks on private networks and such, essentially trying to create an isolated Russian internet where they can control communication
Control the
across.
narrative, yeah.
Exactly, and also control any what everyone's talking about.
And
So
shut down when things get too heated, which, you know, I talked to you about this before, Stuart, is I reference back to Hong Kong, the Hong Kong protests where they shut down the cell networks and folks all had these apps and they were using their phones as to create like a localized network so they could bounce signals, messages from through random strangers' phones across the city. So it's just one example. I'm not a technologist, but it's an example of again the changing times that I alluded to and wanted to come back to is it seems like a very outdated and misplaced attempt instead of just, you know, again, maybe letting go of the reins a little bit and making a little bit room. You know, it seems self-destructive.
well, just to touch upon Iran, they actually deployed military-grade high-power microwave jamming technology to disrupt Starlink terminals to disrupt the protests as well. Right?
Really, I
So,
didn't know that.
yeah, I saw that. The establishment trying to cut back on what we can communicate with when it comes to protests and all is, one of those, the steps of a draconian society or whatever. But what I really want to touch upon about is that Putin, Xi, Erdogan, none of them actually have had any successors outlined, right? We don't know. So once they're gone, their cult of personality and their governmental structure, it's been tied to them, and that'll be gone.
Yeah, one of the things I would say before I want to jump into that, but I would just to reference back, all of their efforts are for naught because none of it's going to work. History's taught us that's not going to work. You know, there's that great line in, you know, Star Wars: A New Hope when Princess Leia is talking about the tighter you grip to Grand Moff Tarkin about the tighter you grip, the more systems will fall through your fingers. Do you know what I'm talking about? It doesn't matter. It's a great quote, but the
Nerd
idea
alert.
it's a great it's Stewart's found how to use the echo. I think it's a really great quote because I don't think that cracking down usually works unless of course you live in Russia and that's just the way it's always been and always will be, I suppose. It's just baked in. But generally speaking, the tighter you grip, I think the less it works. But you know, talking about Putin, speaking about Russia, I'll pivot back to your point here, Stuart. Yeah, Putin doesn't have a very clear heir apparent. And one of the things I'd written a few years ago, an article that was kind of ridiculed at the time is, which I'm still sort of bitter about, is the only thing worse than Russia might be no Russia, which is at some point Putin's gone and there'll be a power vacuum. And I don't see the Russian Federation surviving it. I think you'll see separatists like Chechnya, for example, even though Ramzan Kadyrov is Mr. Putin, I think you'll see them start to be like, oh, I can be the leader of an independent country now. You know, you're seeing them as already starting to assert more independence.
Yeah, even
I,
these,
I
even the independent states of Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, they're all moving away from Russia.
Mhm. Yeah, and so that's, I think, going to be one of the long-term consequences is that power vacuum and the chaos that ensues is something that the West should be very worried about because we're not prepared for it. We're not even culturally educated enough to understand that part of the world for the most part, let alone like forget we can't understand it, let alone confront it. And it's going to be very dangerous for us because we live in a globalized world. But moving away and sort of asserting independences, I think helps explain Turkey, which is, I think, unique. It is a regional power that is not been treated that way We're still sort of treating it like in this Cold War dynamic, East versus West proxy, and I dislike Erdogan quite a bit, but I think it's important to understand what's going on underneath there. Just as it's a sidebar, and I don't want to get into it. That's a whole other episode, but I do think that there's some validity to the Turkish position, but that's beside the point. To your point, sir, there's a lot of leaders who aren't prepared for what comes next, and she's probably a really good example of that because Chinese leaders are generally very sensitive about their legacy and are generally, which isn't a criticism, but they're generally very careful and they generally have a successor in mind, and he doesn't appear to have one.
And at his age, there should be a successor in mind. But if you looked at the past month, he's fired I think five or eight generals from party positions. Right by 2027, you're saying that that's when he's going to be confirmed again.
Yeah, that's when there's a convention, the party annual general meeting or whatever they call it, their big get together, and he'll be reaffirmed, but it'll be his last term.
Totally. And then one of the big numbers is 2027, but also 2049. Xi's made it clear that he wants Taiwan to be absorbed by mainland China at least by 2049, if not earlier.
More importantly, he wants to be the guy to do it, and he doesn't have till 2049.
No, exactly. And just last month, we saw China close down a significant part of its offshore airspace for 40 days. It's still continuous, actually. It's going on until I think end of April, and this led a lot of analysis to actually think maybe China will be moving against Taiwan soon.
Or at least they were testing to see what the responses would be and like dip their toe in the water. They're quite shrewd, but there's no denying that the scale and tempo of PLA training exercises has increased significantly.
Well, totally, especially with isolating Taiwan, they've done many training operations for this over the past 2 to 3 years.
Well, in 2027 being the convention or general meeting or forgive me, I don't know the exact term. That's also, I believe, when she had ordered the PLA to be capable, not that they would, but be capable of I don't know the exact wording, if it was invade Taiwan or be capable of, do you know what I'm talking about?
The military be capable of actually undergoing that operation, going
Yeah,
from
because I don't want to overstate it, but
no, I mean they want to be a blue water navy, right? So
yeah.
that also means not just having aircraft carriers or wherever else. It also means having proper troop transport and wherever else to traverse all the way to Taiwan, including also uh, having an air force capable of flying back and forth, right?
Yeah, power projection out there and to create the envelope needed if they want to do it. Because Taiwan's like an 8 hour sail. It's not like going across the channel, right?
Right. And
So
with the state of the world right now, with Patriot and THAAD systems being sent to the Middle East and being used in its hundreds with Iran, of course, what we've sent to Ukraine as well. I mean, this is a great time for China to invade Taiwan because missile defense and air anti-air assets have been depleted.
the other side of that, though, is we're also learning from that those aren't necessarily what they used to be. Yeah, if you look at like the Ukrainians and what they're doing, maybe that's just a lack of appropriate application, and it's the difference between a peer-to-peer and peer to near peer or peer to non-peer. But Ukrainians, for example, dealing with Shahad drones versus what the Americans were doing. I was reading something recently about a Ukrainian, I don't know if it was a general, an advisor of some kind, being just beside himself at what the US were launching to take down Iranian drones, whereas the Ukrainians are using a much lower tech approach that
Oh,
is more effective too, I might add.
exactly. But, it best to try to invade Taiwan in the short term before we actually start adopting, these Ukrainian anti-drone or anti-missile systems, which are a lot cheaper and a lot more effective, right? Because our procurement systems take forever, right? So
Well,
it's best to get in there in the next 5
the other
years.
side of that is whether or not the PLA is prepared for confronting that in Taiwan. If they end up, the Taiwanese end up throwing that at them, I don't know if they will. I don't know if they're thinking that way. They should be. I've said to you before, I think the future of warfare is in the past, and I think you're seeing it in Ukraine where we're moving towards smaller, more irregular focused forces. And that's a much messier and complicated thing to try and confront, especially in trying to occupy a state that doesn't want to be occupied. And in the case of China and Taiwan, they're the same ethnicity and speak the same language and have the same history. So it's going to be pretty difficult.
We can talk, hours about
Oh
China and
yeah.
Taiwan as well. But going back to boomer dictators and their legacies. I mean, this is Xi's moment, right?
Well, the thing I keep throwing out there is I wouldn't say boomer dictator. I'd say boomer void. And the reason I say that is this is not just about dictators. This is something, especially if you extend it out and you look at some of the older Gen Xers and who are very much raised on the same ideas and like two peas in a pod, boomers and Xers, if you want to look at some of the policies. I think that it's not just an issue of dictators. You're seeing the same thing in the West in democracies, where there's a generational power transfer on the horizon and this generation isn't exactly going quietly, and it's creating a lot of very significant problems because again, without that that avenue for power transfer, you're disenfranchising people. You look at Canada, for example. This is a great place to look. The younger generation's utterly locked out. They can't afford a home. They can't get jobs. They can't afford anything. They're largely locked out of power, except for, symbolic puppet positions. And still the older generation ruling. The same is true in the US. Same is true in the UK. Same is true across the Anglosphere. And you're wondering why you're seeing increased radicalization. I don't know if I've already mentioned it, but Dr. David Betz from the War Studies Department at King's College London predicts that the UK or somewhere in the West could see a low-grade civil war within the next 5 years. That's a startling thing, but I actually agree with it. And I think the UK is actually a prime suspect, I suppose, to see it.
Yeah, we're going to make
And
sure that we're going to put Dr. Bates' article in the show notes for this because when Chris sent it to me too, I laughed it off before I read it.
I think he lays out a pretty compelling case if people give it just an opportunity. Like this is a very serious individual saying this.
Again, we'll make sure it's in the show notes for our
But if
listeners.
if we can't even deal with it, I think my point here is like if it's happening everywhere, and if we can't get our house in order, we're not going to be able to get. That's maybe not the right way to say it, but if we can't get past that generational block, we're not going to be able to get our house in order to prepare ourselves and equip ourselves properly for what's coming down the pipe in other parts of the world when this generational transfer happens, because it will be even worse there.
Well, I mean, when Putin finally goes in Russia, I think it's going to outshadow the fall of the Soviet Union. The Russian economy right now is flatlining. Shifting from a war economy to a regular old civilian economy takes a lot, and usually what happens is that war economy goes into a downward spiral for a bit until civilian production of goods can go up. So we
If they're
saw.
even capable of doing that at this point, the demographic damage that's been done by the war in Ukraine is just staggering.
Well, exactly, and that's what a lot of the things happened with the Soviet Union beforehand. The only case where that wartime economy to civilian economy transition did not have as much of a big dip was post-war World War II in the United States, and that's when they could switch,
Well,
from
yeah,
making a tank into a car, right?
the other side of that too is that the US was the China of the world, and the entire world was completely demolished and knew everything.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying is with Putin's Russia, when that they shift from that post-Ukraine war economy, it's that economy is going to fall even worse than a house of cards.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of hope for that. I think it's going to get very ugly over there, and it's something that we should be more conscious of and worried about. But and this ties it back to our broader thing because that's true in a lot of places where the lack of a viable transfer strategy or generational power transfer strategy is going to lead to very concerning consequences in when these power vacuums start to open up. If we have these, one of the things that worries me is we talked about controlling the narrative or controlling the internet, controlling talking. You're not going to control it, but you're going to drive it underground where it no longer is moderated. And I don't mean moderated as in controlled. I mean there's no moderation. It leads to radicalization and extremism. What I
That
just mean is anytime you drive a group underground, right? Instead of being out in the public discourse where there's moderating influences because it's part of the larger socio-political discourse where everyone's involved in it. If you say you're ostracized, which is something that progressives do a lot, and you are unacceptable and we won't engage with you, we're going to control the internet, whatever it is, so that you can't talk. They're still going to talk, but now it's going to be through alternative means, which is why we're seeing these social silos developing on the internet. And there's a great book, The Psychology of Radicalization and Terrorism by Vanderploot, and I forget the other person's name, but it's worth a read because when you start looking into this sort of thing, you can find a review for it on Bookwatch, on Defense Report. You start to go down this purity spiral, right? You'll have fewer people, but it'll get more purified and more extreme, more radical. So I don't think you're doing yourself any favor by locking people out of the conversation, except you're denying them those moderating influences. It's kind of a long walk from the Hungarian election, but that's the sort of stuff that I start to think about is in terms of this rejection of establishment politics that have been festering, rotting for some time, I guess might be the word. And a lot of that I see as being tied to a generational power transfer that's been stymied, delayed.
The consequences are going to be massive, and especially with some of these older generations like Putin, Xi, what was happening in Iran too, with stopping internet, limiting expression of speech.
Yeah, it's the last thing you should be doing. It's not what people want, and especially the internet, which is a pretty powerful drug.
Well,
Social media. Yeah.
at that point, you need to step down, put your personal legacy ambitions away, which these gentlemen cannot do.
Or
Right.
just build an arch. Just build a golden arch instead.
Well, we haven't even talked about Trump. I mean, in the past year, he's talked about annexation of Greenland. He's talked about, well, regime change in Iran. He has conducted some sort of limited regime change in Venezuela, limiting oil to Cuba. They were hoping regime change there. I mean, that's to me a personal legacy that he was trying to do within 18 months.
Yeah, this is someone who I think, and I don't want to just pick on one person, but it's someone who's terrified of their own mortality, which is helps explain Ukraine as well with Putin. And I think it would help explain China in Taiwan if that were to occur.
We've seen with Trump's personal ambition to get a Nobel Peace Prize, right? That idea of creating an ongoing legacy, and also
Putting his
just
name on everything or building a massive North American empire with Canada and Greenland. Yeah, he's casting about. I think that helps explain a lot of it. He's just casting about for some sort of a legacy building project.
yeah. So, and a lot of these guys are, Xi in Taiwan, Putin and Ukraine. Erdogan has actually, I think, done it in some respects with the disarmament of the ongoing disarmament of the PKK and quashing other Kurdish groups within Iraq, Syria, and Iran.
Yeah, he might arguably be the most successful in some respects, but the other side of it too is Turkey's going to be in a very difficult place when he passes away as well.
He has definitely walked the fine line between Moscow and Washington and Brussels like an expert tightrope
Well,
walker.
and this comes back to what I was saying before about Turkey's a regional power and sees itself as, right? Allies doesn't mean friends. They're all independent actors with their own agendas and their own interests, and that's fine. It's not a criticism per se, but I think Turkey needs to be understood in that way, right? They are a substantial regional power, and I don't necessarily think they get their credit for that. But the problem is the way that Erdogan's gone about doing it, especially with the forces he's co-opted domestically. They're concerning in the long term, especially the direction towards conservative Islam he's reached.
Exactly, and that is going to be an episode for a future podcast. Just Turkey.
But one of the things about it is this is the lens it should be understood under. But this is one of the things that worries me and scares the crap out of me about Mark Carney and the way everyone's falling all over themselves to celebrate his speech at Davos. Is this embracing that generation seems to be quite gleefully embracing the collapse of the rules-based international order that was built out of the Second World War, and talking about multipolarity, not really understanding what I just alluded to with, Turkey being independent third party actor, looking at it their own way. Multipolarity is dangerous. Multipolarity leads to war, right? That's my view. I think that for better or worse, the Cold War actually offered a mechanism, a very imperfect mechanism for stability, and American hegemony did as well. European and American transatlantic hegemony uh, was a stabilizing force, and I get really worried at how willing this group of individuals are at this age to throw away the status order, to throw away tradition, to throw away the underpinnings of the state, be them cultural, symbolic, the way they're undermining the judiciary for a short or quick win. And so when we talk about long-term consequences, we need to not just look at, Xi or Erdogan or Putin, which is, very, very terrifying, but our ability to weather them means first looking at home at the things we're doing and the damage we're doing to ourselves. It's methodology matters, right?
Yeah, totally. And
And
and also I want to get back to Carney's speech too, just quickly before we wrap things up. I mean, oratory, it was great, right? It hit the keynote for the theme of the Davos. However, if you ever take a look at the Malayan dialogue, which he alluded to within his speech, it was about the Peloponnesian War, Athens versus Sparta, right? And the Athenians were going to the Isle of Mythos and said, "You either have to join us or you'll be slaughtered." Well, the people of Milos thought, okay, well, the Spartans might come, but we're not going to do it. Well, they were subjugated. The men were killed. The women and children were taken as prisoners within the Athenians. It was still a bipolar world, right, within that region. Comparison of us going from a bipolar world or a unipolar world on the America into great power
competition or
competition rivalry. It does not hit the spot. It's historically inaccurate and also inaccurate. It's just any simile. So that's what we need to generally get ready for, is that we're now going to a regional great power competition
we also
across the
need,
board.
I think, this is something I talked to you about outside of the podcast, is we need a more historically literate leadership. Everyone's been talking about STEM, 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 but we need to start talking more about social science and particularly applied history, because we don't have a very good understanding of these historical case studies that we're alluding to in these speeches and what actually played out and how they actually worked. One of the things I said to you, Stewart, in regards to my studies is if you look at the British in the Second World War, every single leader, every single member of every ministry, they had either fought the First World War, like in the trenches, or they had fought the First World War from the government. These are, the mandarins at the Foreign Office. These were lifers, right? They'd been there the whole time. They'd been there. They were careerists, and so they had a much, much better understanding of the forces that they were confronting and dealing with, which explains the British approach to the Second World War, which was a lot more cautious, indirect approach, a lot less, very different from the Americans. And I don't want to delve into a Second World War lesson here, but the point I'm making is they had leaders who understood war and understood what they were dealing with, and we don't. And it's something that needs to be corrected really quickly because we're getting into serious time and we can't have actors and theater students up on the pulpit anymore.
Well, and on that note, we should wrap up this episode of Defense Sports Podcast. Thank you much for everyone for listening. And again, please like, follow, and leave us a comment. That's how our podcast gets noticed by everyone else. And Chris, thank you very much for your comments again. And this conversation has been enlightening as our conversations on the podcast before. And
Yeah, reach out and talk to us. And
all
thanks
right,
for listening.
thank you. All right, take care.
Bye bye.